Hey friends, my name is Bruce Kendrick and welcome to Intro to Foster Care and Adoption. We are so excited that you are considering giving of your family to vulnerable children and families who are in need. And we want to help you steward your next decisions as you move forward in this process about all the different things that there are to consider and be wise about, that you would seek wise counsel from people in your community group or small group there in your church, that you'd have great conversations with your family about all that might be involved in foster care or adoption, that you consider all the different paths, and we realize this can feel really overwhelming. So we want to make sure that you have the information that you need in order to make the best decisions to move forward, and we want to walk through all of that, help you unpack it in a pretty succinct way. So you've got your workbook in front of you, follow along. There will be some fill in the blanks and some things, but allow me to introduce my family to you real quick. As I mentioned, my name's Bruce. This is my wife Denise and 8 of our 9 children. So we don't usually start with that because immediately we get all kinds of questions of like, wait, are you Mormon? Are you Catholic? Are you homeschooling? And the answer is no to all 3 of those. However, God has used our family as we were just faithful in opening ourselves up one child at a time, understanding the biblical mandates to care for vulnerable children in our communities. And it honestly was just something that we went, hey, we've read about caring for orphans in the Bible somewhere. And so we had available space to use and just went, let's be good stewards with it, and opened up one child at a time. And as our biological family grew, those are the redheads that you're seeing there, our foster or adoptive family grew as well. And over time, we had all these kids and God provided more space, and so we stewarded it. It has been an absolute joy just to allow God to use us, as well as just rip the facade of our faith off so that we might just be raw and available for whatever He brought to us. And it's been a tremendous blessing. So with that, I want to introduce my friend Katie to you and let her share a little bit about her family as well.
Hi, I'm Katie. This is my family. This is my husband, Alan, and we have 4 kiddos, Piper, Jude, Paul, and a new little baby named Ellen. So we were a foster family for a little while and then stopped that, did some respite, and now I get the honor to serve here in this ministry. Yeah,
one of the best parts about getting to serve with people like Katie is we often think, gosh, we need foster and adoptive families to lead the charge in this. And while they gave of themselves and continue to do so, there are lots of other positions and roles and volunteer opportunities for people to jump in. And so we're going to talk about some of the different responses that you may have coming out of the different sessions we're going to do as we walk through intro together. But we want to make sure that we set those things appropriately before you and help you think both biblically and rightly about what are the needs and how we approach this as believers. So you've got some attachments there in your workbook for session 1. And one of those is a set of disavowals and affirmations that John Piper proposed through Desiring God, just called Christian Disavowals and Affirmations on Adoption. We want to make sure that you're thinking biblically about this whole process so that you're setting what God's Word says about caring for vulnerable children in front of even what your own desires may be to grow your family or have a family or meet a need and care for a child. Secondly, we've got a statement based on IVF, so in vitro fertilization, cryopreservation, and genetic testing, because one of the possible outcomes that you may walk away from this course from is that you end up doing a snowflake adoption, or one of the children that is currently a frozen embryo that is a unique life that God has brought worth and value and dignity to, that we want to honor and uphold. And you may decide to have that child implanted and have that child born and join your family. And so that's something we want to make sure you think through and understand some of the complexities and nuances of. And then the last thing is the Adverse Childhood Experiences quiz. So Adverse Childhood Experiences is also known as ACEs, and we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. But this quiz will help you get a little bit of insight, not only to your own past, but also to the past of any child that you might bring into your home, that you might care for, who has trauma in their background, as you think about how that trauma impacts them developmentally, chronologically, educationally, or even what their understanding of who they are as an individual human being that God has created is, because all of that gets impacted whenever we have trauma in our backgrounds. So with that being said, we always like to start with a myth. Why don't you kick us off?
So each session will have a different myth that you've probably heard around either in the foster adoption world or just someone has said. And so we want to unpack that a little bit. So today we're going to talk about adoption is God's plan B for our family.
Man, yeah. So we hear this a lot, sometimes especially with families who experience infertility, of like, gosh, we couldn't have a biological child, and so adoption must be plan B. And one of the problems with this idea is the idea that God doesn't control all things. He doesn't orchestrate all things. And at the same time, it may be appropriate for you to kind of step back and go, hey, it is God's plan A that children should be raised by their biological mom and dad. And yet we know that sin has entered the picture. We know that we are sinful. And so there is going to be that tendency for plan Bs and Cs and Ds and Es and Fs. And even some of the hard realities in adoption are that there are children who are placed for adoption, and then the adoption is disrupted before it's able to be finalized in court, or a child may even have an adoption finalized and the family, through any myriad of circumstances that we might go into later, may just come to the conclusion that they are not able to care for that child like they intended to when they first got started. And so 2 Samuel 14:14 says that God does not take away life, but instead he devises ways so a banished person may not remain estranged from him. And so God is in the business of bringing things together and restoring things and making a way where sin has created chaos and brokenness. And we get invited into that, whether that's, again, plan A with a biological child that we have been a part of creating, plan B, whether that's through a foster care or adoption, plan C, plan D, whatever it is, God is at work. And so if you're discouraged by the experience of infertility, or even maybe a foster care placement that didn't result in adoption, or an adoptive placement that didn't result in a finalized adoption, we want you to understand that God is at work in your family and through you, that in some ways you can grip that loosely and just go, hey God, this is yours. My family is yours. I am yours. This body that you have given me is yours, and I am a steward of all these things. So be thoughtful about some of those things that are out there, lots of cliches that we're going to address in these different myths each session, and make sure that you're thinking biblically and rightly about what's ahead. So let me start with some opening thoughts as we get going. First, we firmly believe that not all people have to adopt or foster, but more should than do. So there are lots of folks that you'll meet, you probably have already met them, you may even be one of them who has said, gosh, I would foster, I could just never attach to a child and then give that child back, and that would just be really hard. And so that's not to say that there aren't some really hard things that we have to navigate, and yet God has mandated, instructed in His Word that we are to be a people who care for vulnerable children and families. So whether or not we do that directly through foster care or adoption and opening of our home and giving of our family, or whether we do that through supporting one another or working with a biological parent or becoming a CASA, or all the other ways that we can be impactful in the lives of these vulnerable children and families, you can still be involved. We don't want you to get lost in some sense that there's a hierarchy of the people who adopt are somehow the most holiest, and then the people who foster are just below them, or vice versa, and then there's everybody kind of down from there. Your response should be a faithful response of whatever God's doing with the resources He's given you, that you would steward those to glorify, honor, and worship Him. So secondly, because every child is unique, every adoption and foster care story is going to be unique as well. There are certainly some common things that we see in the lives of kids who have been abused or neglected. There are certainly some common things we see internationally in orphan care and even in private infant adoption. However, we want to approach each child with a sensitivity to their needs, and we want to approach you with a sensitivity to your thoughts and your experiences, your marriage, or even in your singleness, what that might look like for you to open your home and give of yourself. Lastly, let's acknowledge from the start that this can be an emotional topic for a variety of reasons. And so we're not going to just plow through all of the facts as if this doesn't connect with your heart and your mind in some way. We realize there's lots to pray through, but you're going to hear us say this a lot. Let's not be paralyzed in our prayer. Prayer is meant to move us forward. God is a God of faithfulness who is asking us to trust Him to take the next step. And so we're going to address kind of what your next options are. But before we do that, I'm going to ask Katie to kind of go through some different commitments that we have that we want to make sure you understand as we keep going.
Yeah, so we commit to being honest with you about adoption and foster care, the beautiful and the hard. So what you'll see in this class is we don't need to have a whole session about all the great things that are going to come in foster care and adoption, about a child who's going to just come in your home and fit in perfectly, or all the joys and blessings that come with it. But we do want to prepare you for the hard things. And so we're going to be honest with you about what that looks like, about the trauma, the things that can come with these kiddos. We want you to feel confident in the knowledge that we're giving you as you're making these decisions for your family. We also commit to not pulling emotional strings for the purpose of manipulating you. So we're not going to show videos of beautiful adoption stories and kiddos' faces and all those things, because we want you to go in with knowing the facts, and this to not be an emotional decision based solely on how you feel. We also commit to letting the Lord be the one to lead you to adopt or foster, while we share our experiences and provide counsel to steward your decisions. So you're going to hear lots of different people's stories, and they all look different. And so we want you to make a decision that is best for your family and where you feel the Lord leading, whether that's respite or just helping another family or fostering yourself. And so we won't push you any direction. We want you to do what you feel is best for you. There's a couple appropriate responses as you're going through this class. So the first is you discern that the Lord is leading you to adopt or foster, so you begin to move in that direction. So at the end of this class, if you feel like a confident yes, you and your spouse are both confident yeses, then that would be moving on to find out more information about agencies and getting licensed to foster or adopt. The second one is you discern that the Lord is leading you toward adoption or foster care, but not at this moment. So maybe as you're going through this process, you'll see there's some things that you really need to deal with before you bring another child into your home. So whether that's regeneration, which is a 12-step recovery program, or a marriage ministry that maybe you and your spouse need to get back on the same page about some things, we want you to stop and do those first to make sure you're at your best before you try to serve other children and bring them in your home.
Yeah, it never fails. There's always a couple who goes through intro and realizes, oh, I didn't quite share that with you before we got married, and now that we're going through this process and thinking about bringing a child into this, I might need to share this part of my past or something of that nature. So a child placing agency, a foster care agency that's going to license you to become foster parents or adoptive parents is going to require you to do that. They're going to do background checks and those types of things. So now's a great time to start to have some of those conversations. If you've got kind of anything in your closet you haven't pulled out and dealt with yet, now's a great time to do that. You're going to want to do that before you keep moving forward to help a vulnerable child. Because as we'll talk about later, when vulnerable children who've been neglected or abused come into your home, they tend to kind of push some buttons and find some things going on in your life and in your heart that you haven't resolved yourself, and those things come out then. So better now than later, for sure.
Yes. I would add, if infertility is part of your story, that we would advise you to stop and make sure you've dealt with that. You've spoken with your spouse. Find some women who have walked through that already so that you don't jump into foster care or adoption looking for a child who's going to fill that gap. The third appropriate response is that you discern adoption or foster care is not your response to God's instruction to care for these children and families. So you begin to look for other ways to respond. And we will talk more about that later, but there's so many ways you can serve vulnerable children without having them in your home. So whether it's respite, which is just having them for the weekend, or a CASA who as a support for that child in courts, or even just providing meals, helping support the families who have those kids come in, helping the biological moms as they're trying to get their kiddos back. There's so many ways for you to serve, and so know that in the back of your mind, that's an option, and it's a need that's out there.
Yeah, so we certainly wouldn't say that the primary need isn't for there to be families who give of themselves, who open their homes. That is absolutely the priority that we want to help steer you towards and encourage you towards. But we want you to be discerning as you think about the different responses that may come. And CASA, being one of those court-appointed special advocates, is just one of those opportunities, as well as some of the mentoring and things. And so whether you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area around Watermark, where we can help you or your church be involved in that, or you're somewhere else in the country, there are opportunities for you to get involved. In the fourth session of Intro, we're actually going to invite you to have your family and friends watch that session with you and kind of unpack the different needs your family may have to wrap around you with that support network, or what we're going to call a care circle, so that you have support, because this is not a journey you take on your own. This is absolutely something that you make sure you have at least 4 people that are going to wrap around you, that are going to care for you well, that are going to strengthen you, that even when you're really stressed or you feel overwhelmed, you can pick up the phone and vent for 5 minutes or so. And then You've got people who love you enough to remind you of why you stepped into this gap, to encourage you, to even give you a break if that's needed, and then to keep pressing forward with the needs of that child or the needs in your marriage or family to be able to care for that child well. So you may not be the person who opens your home. You may be that person that picks up the phone and allows somebody to vent, and then you remind them because you've gone through a class like Intro, because you're informed and thoughtful about what that child needs and what that child has experienced and been through, and maybe even what your friend needs or what you need, so that everybody is as healthy as they can possibly be. There's nobody here who should survive foster care or adoption. You want to thrive in this, and God wants that for you, but it's not something you can do on your own. I know our family was very much in that mindset of like, hey, this is going to be a ministry we have. And so we discerned that God was leading us to adoption and foster care. We moved in that direction, but we did it all by ourselves for like 5 years. And we started to burn out. And then we had loving people that came alongside us and just went, you need help. Let us impose help on you. Let us bring meals over. Let us care for you well. And we started to open up and see the richness of God's family, of the church being the church and caring for us well and caring for the kids in our care well, so that they saw other examples of God-fearing people that would love them, that would care for them, that would want their family restored, or that would want them to experience a permanency in a family, in a home where they knew they could belong.
So we've been doing Intro for about 10 years now, and we usually have 4 groups of people who are here. The biggest group are usually couples who are walking through infertility. The next biggest section are families who have biological children but just see a need and are wondering if they can fill it. The third group are single folks, men and women, who are here to see how God can use them in this area. And the fourth group is usually just people who are curious, wanting to learn more about foster care and adoption, seeing if this makes sense for their life.
Yeah. So let us address each of those 4 groups real quick. First, for those who are experiencing infertility, the desire for children is a God-given desire. We realize this is not what you planned, and we are so glad that you're here. I want to just take a minute and pause. If this is a part of your story, would you just pause the video and look up these passages and just reflect on, especially if you've only dealt with infertility a little bit and maybe haven't really processed through it fully, unpack some of these passages and what they mean to your God-given desire to care for children. For those responding to the need, the desire to meet needs of vulnerable children and families is also a God-given desire. We love your enthusiasm, your passion, and want to provide adequate information to help you process what you're feeling. However, we don't want you to get carried away with that passion. So we do want to help you check some of that, especially if you're that really passionate wife who has dragged your husband here and he has come kicking and screaming, or even just kind of begrudgingly, and he's here and he's available and he's listening, or vice versa. Sometimes we see that the other way around, where we have a really passionate husband who is just super geared up to meet this need, and a wife who's just, I'm not so sure about this. But if that's a part of your motivation and why you're here, we're going to talk about motivations and decisions in the second session. But would you pause the video for just a second, look up these passages, Deuteronomy 10, 18 through 19, and Psalms, and Isaiah, and James, and think through, process, and pray through what those passages mean for you responding to the need of these kids. Thirdly, for those of you who are single, the desire to be purposeful in your singleness is a God-given gift. We recognize the thought of becoming a single parent can be scary, and we want to encourage you with that. And so pause the video, spend some time looking at these passages and thinking about how God's purpose for your life might be a gift to a child in need.
We've created a spectrum, as you can see below, to show the dynamics of foster care and adoption. They change from season to season, from day to day. So if you look down, you'll see on one side we have the rainbows and cupcakes and unicorns, and on the other side you'll see the Twizzlers and the peas. And the reason we share this is because some days can feel like a roller coaster of emotions. Everything's great, and then it can get really hard. You may notice when a child first comes to your house, everything's so happy and the kids are getting to know each other and it's so fun. And as soon as that honeymoon phase ends, it can get hard. And so we just want you to be able to see, even through that roller coaster, the big picture of having your kids in your home, that there's reasons behind their behaviors. And if you can understand the trauma, you can better help those kiddos work through it.
Yeah, so A foundation of parenting that we like to direct couples towards, or even single adults towards, is understanding that the goal of parenting is to faithfully steward the next generations to know and love Christ. We want to make sure that when a child shows up and stands before God in judgment, that they don't go, "Oh, I had no idea," but that parents faithfully cared for them, loved them, shared the gospel, prayed with them. And so sort of a few points that we like to throw in there just to help you outline the idea of this foundation is that we want to model Christ-likeness. We want to train a child in the way that they should go. We want to continually and diligently and specifically pray for that child. And then ultimately we realize that the outcomes of what God does with their salvation, with their life, is in God's hands. And so we can steward them, we can care for them, we can use all the resources at our disposal, and we want to be flexible in our parenting and understand that not every child is the same. Some kids need somebody who's providing more structure. Some kids need a little bit more space to run and roam. So you're going to get to learn some of what each child that comes into your care needs, whether that's a biological child, whether it's a child in foster care, or whether it's an adopted child. You've got to be a good detective of what their needs are. And so your role is to be a disciple maker, right? You've got to be discipling those kids, praying for them, training them up, reminding them and teaching them what God's word says, helping them experience life, that they would get their hands dirty and realize that they are capable of way more than anything that they imagined, because maybe they just didn't have some of those experiences early on, and you get to be a part of that. It is such a rewarding part of all of this, even for kids who really struggle, who've experienced a lot of neglect or a lot of abuse, because they just don't know that they are capable of doing some of the things that they're capable of. Even if it's in school or doing something around the house or cooking or being outside, those are all opportunities you have to help them grow. And so your role is discipling them in that. And they're going to be discipled by something, by someone. It's just a matter of who is that someone, or what is that something they're going to be discipled by. Secondly, our goal, again, is to be faithful. So we don't get to control whether or not a child comes to know the Lord. We don't have to get ourselves hung up on all of that, but we do have to be faithful with sharing the gospel with them, with loving them well, encouraging them, being patient, growing ourselves so that we can be faithful through their time with us, whether that's foster care or whether that's adoption, and they're going to be with us for the rest of their lives as a member of our family. And all of that is really exciting times, but we have to understand the biblical precedent of caring for children is to restore them to their biological family. So we've got to be faithful stewards. It can be just as rewarding to go, man, I got to be a part of seeing that child go back to their biological mom or get to know their biological dad and cared for and loved, and that whole family is coming together and they're experiencing this reconciliation that they had no idea was even possible before until they met the people of the church, until they got in contact with our family. Or it's that child who's waiting to be adopted that you get to give of your family for. So the foundation of parenting, again, is that you would be a faithful steward. We want to spend just another second talking about kind of child development and how kids grow in families as you start with parents. Because again, when we look at how God designed the family to grow, we see a biological mom who's committed to a biological dad in a loving marital relationship, and they have sex and they create children and they grow from there. So we know scientifically, biologically, even biblically, that human life begins at fertilization. That moment, I'm going to get a little awkward because we get to oversee all these things at Watermark with our life initiatives. We know that when a sperm is fertilizing an egg, that is when a new human life begins, that there is unique DNA there. And yet we also know that there can be stressors even in pregnancy while an embryo or fetus is developing in the womb, that there can be things that impact their development that factor into their growth and the outcomes that they have later in life. And that's what adverse childhood experiences tends to track. And so the quiz that is in your workbook that you're going to take for yourself is one that you can kind of see with some of the kids that'll come into your care. You may even be able to meet their biological parents at visits or things like that, where you get to know some of their story and kind of unpack, hey, what kind of things might they have experienced in their childhood that has led them to this point where their child has to be removed into foster care or their child has to be placed for adoption. And so we know that stress levels of pregnant pregnant women can be found in an infant up to 6 months after delivery. That means that the stress that a mom might have from being single or being in a domestic violence relationship or dealing with poverty or maybe something else related to her pregnancy where she's just told that she's made a mistake or she can't do anything right or there aren't people there celebrating her and celebrating this child, she may have some of that stress. And that stress, not just the food and the things that she drinks get passed on to her child, that stress gets passed on as well. So as we think about behaviors that children may exhibit, we need to recognize that those are symptoms of fear and love. So I want to dilute sort of all the emotions that are out there of anger and frustration and happiness and joy, really down to 2 essential emotions. And this isn't some kind of scientific study. I realize there are more emotions out there. But at a base level, you've got those who experience fear and are afraid and have insecurities, and those who experience love and wantedness. And so those behaviors often stem from a lack of wantedness or from a trauma or a neglect or an abuse or an insecurity that a child's had because they didn't receive the kind of attention that God has designed us to experience from the time that we are conceived until the time that we are born. As we continue to develop, God has created moms and dads to be able to play with their kids, provide for their kids, and these are often children who have not experienced those things because they're stuck in generational cycles of abuse or addiction or poverty from their biological family. So be thoughtful about the types of experience that the children that you're going to care for have had. And as you do that, take a look at this next slide and this image about the different adverse childhood experiences, whether it's physical, emotional, or even sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, which can often be the most damaging thing to a child. We know that physical abuse often tells a child and communicates to them that they are unwanted or that they are hated even, but neglect says you don't exist. And so for a child to be neglected does incredible damage to their own psyche and to their own identity as a human being to go, do I even matter? Additionally, there are household dysfunctions like mental illness, incarceration, substance abuse, maybe even divorce that we've got to take into consideration when we think about how a child is coming into our home. If your home has a husband and a wife in it, maybe even other kids, understand that there may be children that come into your family that have never seen mom and dad in this loving relationship where they encourage one another, where they submit to one another and sacrifice for one another. And so be thoughtful about those different aspects that a child may have experienced in their own nuclear family or biological family rather, that as you're caring for them, as you're parenting them, you understand where their heart is, where their mind is, so that you can care for them better. So as you're starting this class, we've got 5 more sessions after this, and we want you to picture yourself coming up to an intersection and seeing the lights, red light, yellow light, green light. Because before you move forward with whatever your next step's going to be, we want to make sure, especially if you're married, that you and your spouse are on the same page, okay? A red light means, nope, we're not moving forward. This is as far as we go. We're stopping right here. A yellow light means, I'm feeling okay, but I still have lots of questions. A green light means, hey, I still have questions, but I'm ready to keep moving forward faithfully with whatever the next steps are. I know this is what God has for us, okay? It's okay for you to be any one of those lights. However, if your spouse is also not a full-on green light, then you're not moving forward yet. So when you're ready to move forward with whatever your next step may be, whatever your appropriate, faithful response may be, we want to make sure you're both green lights on that. And we know lots of moms, lots of dads who have come out of this class and gone, I'm still a full green light, but my spouse is a red or my spouse is a yellow. And that's okay. Again, we want the Lord to lead your family. We want the Lord to lead you in this and not be here trying to convince you one way or another, but just set the options in front of you, allow you to hear what God's word says about who we are as his people and what our role is to care for the vulnerable in our communities, and then for you to faithfully move forward from that. Again, don't get paralyzed in prayer. That's not what prayer is for. If you find yourself 3 to 6 months from now going, hey, we're still praying about it, then you're probably not praying correctly about it. Prayer is meant to move you in a direction. And if that direction means you're not going to open your home, then that's fine. That may be exactly what God intends for you to do, for you to then turn and serve in some other way. But don't stop down and just be red light for the sake of being a red light. Eventually, there needs to be a green in a direction that you go and that you see God use you, because that's what He's designed and created you for, is to glorify, honor, and worship Him, faithfully taking and stewarding whatever He has put at your disposal and putting it to use for His kingdom. If you'd like to get more information about all that's going on, whether it's with Family Restoration at Watermark or some other ministry in your area, feel free to shoot us an email or go to watermark.org/family restoration. You can scroll down to the bottom of our webpage and sign up for a link to receive our newsletter. There's an email address there as well. There's a little bit more information about some of the other ministries that we lead, and we would love to talk to you or your church about what the next steps are to faithfully respond to the biblical instruction to care for vulnerable children. So if your church is kind of sitting back and going, well, we've got this intro class, but we don't really know how to support our foster and adoptive families or help them in times of crisis, we can help. If you're going, gosh, we want to care for biological families, we want to help you find the resources that are available in your area or connect you to some of the work that we're doing so that you can care for those families. And so don't get stuck. Ask good questions, continue to pray, talk to your church's leadership, and let's get after it together, because there is more than enough need out there. There are children in need of families, there are opportunities to serve, and there's a whole system of foster care, either domestically here in the United States or even internationally with some of the orphanages you may work with or partner with, that we can help restore families and care for them as God intended us. Hey, thanks so much for sitting in on session 1. We'll see you in session 2.